They said, no one survived Block 7, but I did. I saw things that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Faces without names, whispers from the dead, and a terror that feeds on fear itself. Watch carefully. Some secrets should never be revealed. It was the 23rd of November, 1943, when the camp fell into a silence that felt unnatural, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The northern wind swept across the frozen grounds, rattling the iron gates, yet the chill that gripped the prisoners was not from the cold. From the first moments after the evening roll call, a subtle tension began to coil itself around the barracks. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a faint creaking of the wooden floors or the soft whisper of air through the cracks in the walls, easily dismissed as the sound of the camp settling into its nightly routine. But soon, those who lingered in the shadows of Block 7 began to hear something different, a sound that was not quite human, a moan that twisted and bent in ways the human throat could not replicate. It was low at first, barely more than a tremor in the darkness, yet it grew into a chorus of distorted sighs and agonized wails that set every nerve on edge. The prisoners tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a new guard walking the perimeter, or the wind dragging broken metal across the frozen courtyard. But no explanation sufficed. Even the most seasoned men, who had endured months of starvation and brutality, felt a chill that penetrated past their clothing and sank deep into their bones. It was as though something ancient, something older than the snow and the barbed wire, had awakened inside the camp. And those who were awake to it, the few who dared stay alert after lights out, knew that the moaning came from within, from places that should have been empty and silent. By the next morning, whispers had begun to spread. Tales of strange happenings in Block 7 circulated among the prisoners like smoke curling from a dying fire. They spoke of shadows moving where there was no light, of shapes that lurked just beyond the vision, too fast or too fluid to be caught in the corner of an eye. Some claimed to have seen figures without faces, drifting along the walls, or standing at the foot of their bunks, observing silently. Those who attempted to describe these visions found that words failed them. Every account sounded absurd, as though the terror itself mocked the limitations of language. Yet the fear was real. It twisted their thoughts, disrupted sleep, and made even the briefest moments of solitude unbearable. Among the prisoners, there was one who refused to be paralyzed by fear. Nikita Ivanov, a former engineer from Leningrad, had survived the purges, interrogations, and the relentless march of months in the camp. He had studied mechanics and structures, and there was a part of him that needed to understand the world, even when the world threatened to devour him. On the fourth night, as the other prisoners cowered under their thin blankets, Nikita crept through the shadowed corridors of Block 7, carrying nothing but a small lantern stolen from the guardroom. His footsteps were deliberate, measured, each creak of the floorboards echoing like a drumbeat in the silence. He was searching, though he did not yet know what he would find. The first sign came when he reached the corner of the main hallway. A shadow detached itself from the wall, impossible in its fluidity, stretching upward and then contracting in ways no human form could. Nikita froze, heart hammering against his ribs, and the figure paused as though it had noticed him. Then, without a sound, it moved along the wall, gliding rather than walking, leaving no footprint, no trace of its passage. He felt the air shift around him, thickening, pressing against his chest, and the faint moans returned, soft, urgent, whispering names he could not recognize. He realized, with a dread that stole his breath, that the voices were repeating the names of prisoners, past and present, their syllables curling into his mind like smoke into a chimney. Nikita knew he could not simply walk away. Something in him compelled him to pursue it. He followed the shadow down narrow corridors, through rusted doors and staircases that led to the lower levels of the block. The further he went, the darker it became, and the more distorted the air seemed, as if the darkness itself had substance. The moaning increased, now mingled with a low, guttural humming that seemed to come from the very walls. He reached the basement, a place he had never dared enter before. The door was heavy, groaning on its hinges, and beyond it was a darkness so complete that his lantern barely cut a circle of dim light. Inside the basement, the horror became tangible. Rows of shapes stood silently in the darkness, tall and thin, their outlines just perceptible. They were human in some sense, yet not human. Their forms were twisted, limbs bent at impossible angles, skin pale and translucent in the lantern's faint glow. Nikita could not tell if they were alive or dead, only that they were aware of his presence. And in their midst floated the faceless shadow he had followed, moving gracefully among the others as though orchestrating their stillness. The moans and whispers grew louder, swelling into a chorus that filled the small basement until Nikita felt it vibrating in his very bones. He reached out instinctively, needing to touch something solid, and as his hand met the cold, damp wall, he felt a pressure behind him. Turning quickly, he saw one of the figures move closer. Its face was featureless, smooth as polished stone, and yet he felt it studying him, dissecting him. He stumbled back, the lantern falling and casting grotesque shadows across the walls. In the brief flashes of light, he glimpsed other figures shifting, as if the darkness itself had grown hungry and was reaching for him. Panic surged, yet he could not flee. The basement stairs seemed to stretch farther away with every step, the shadows multiplying, twisting, and moving independently of any source of light. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, Nikita could not be sure. Time had become meaningless, a fluid concept warped by the basement's oppressive presence. When he finally crawled back toward the stairs, the shadows receded, as if satisfied with their demonstration of power. Yet the fear remained, embedding itself in every nerve, every thought. He realized the basement was no mere prison of bricks and mortar. It was a trap, a holding place for something that had emerged from the cruelty and suffering of the camp itself. The human pain, the fear, the anger. It had coalesced into these entities, feeding them, shaping them, until they were something else entirely. Returning to his bunk, Nikita did not sleep. He listened to the moans, the subtle shifting of the air, and the distant echoes from Block 7. Others stirred, murmuring in their sleep, but none could describe what he had witnessed. He knew, deep in his heart, that speaking of it might be even more dangerous than remaining silent. For something was watching, always. It collected fear, nurtured it, and used it as a tether to the living world. And in the shadows, the faceless figure moved, marking the names of those who had seen it, ensuring that their minds would never rest. By the fourth night, the phenomenon had escalated. Prisoners began to disappear without warning. One would go to the latrine, another to fetch water, and never return. No guard noticed. If they did not speak. The camp seemed to accept the losses as routine, but Nikita knew better. He had seen the basement. He understood the source. And he realized, with a sickening certainty, that the faceless entities were multiplying, emerging wherever fear had taken root. Each scream, Each whispered prayer, each tremor of terror fed them, and soon the camp itself would become a living extension of their hunger. The prisoners whispered about the basement in hushed tones. Some claimed to have been touched by invisible hands. Some said they saw their own shadows move independently, mocking them. Nikita continued his nightly vigil, compelled by the need to understand, yet increasingly aware that comprehension carried its own risk. He began to record what he could: scratches on scraps of paper, diagrams of the shadow shapes, even attempts to describe the sound of the moans in words, though language failed him. What he captured only confirmed his growing fear. The basement was no ordinary cell. It was an incubator, a place where the suffering of the living had given rise to something else, something ancient, intelligent, and merciless. The prisoner's sanity frayed. Sleep became impossible. Even the strongest, the men who had survived frostbite, hunger, and torture, began muttering to themselves, eyes wide and unseeing. Nikita saw the signs: hand tremors, frantic scribbling, staring into nothing for hours. Fear was contagious, and in the environment of Block 7, it became a virus. And then, on the 7th night, he heard it. Not the moans, not the whispers, but a voice, clear and direct, speaking his name from the basement. It was neither human nor animal. It carried a weight, a resonance that made the air thrum. Nikita shivered. He knew that the entity had marked him, that it was drawing him deeper into its world, into its hunger. He could not resist. He descended the stairs once more, lantern in hand, heart pounding with a mixture of dread and fascination. The basement door groaned as he pushed it open, the shadows welcoming him like a predator circling prey. Shapes shifted in anticipation. The faceless figure floated near the center, as if expecting him. The moans rose to a crescendo, a deafening symphony of pain, sorrow, and anger. Nikita stepped forward, and in that instant he understood. This was not the work of ghosts, nor punishment for sins. This was the culmination of the camp itself, its cruelty and suffering given form, and now fully aware, fully conscious, fully alive. And yet, he could not turn back. Something compelled him forward, a need to witness, to confront, to survive by understanding. His story, the story of what he saw in the basement of Block 7, had only just begun. For the entities were patient, and patience was far older than time. Отлично! Вот вторая часть истории на английском языке. Сюжет развивается, ужас усиливается, раскрываются новые детали сущностей в блоке номер 7, психика заключенных рушится, приближается кульминация. The next night, Nikita could not sleep. The memory of the basement haunted him, replaying in fragments of sound and shadow, twisting every corner of his mind. The faces, or the absence of them, lingered, etched into his thoughts as if branded there. He had begun to notice changes in the other prisoners. Some murmured in the dark, speaking names or phrases that were not their own. Others flinched at invisible touches or whispered into the air, as if replying to a voice only they could hear. The camp had become a stage for unseen actors, and the play was one of fear, despair, and incomprehensible purpose. At dusk, he noticed something unusual. A small group of prisoners huddled near the far wall, pointing toward the floorboards where the shadows pooled most densely. Their faces were pale, eyes wide, and they shook slightly, as if caught between terror and fascination. One of them, an older man named Pavel, muttered words that made Nikita's stomach tighten. "It grows stronger. It is feeding. Every scream, every heartbeat. It is hungry. Nikita nodded silently, realizing that Pavel was right. The entity, or entities, thrived on the fear and suffering of those confined within Block 7. Compelled by a mix of terror and curiosity, Nikita decided to observe the shadows from a new vantage. He waited until the camp was silent, the guards asleep or indifferent, and slipped through the narrow corridors, lantern in hand. The moaning had returned, swelling in intensity as he approached the basement door. He could feel the air vibrate with the presence of something immense, unseen, yet palpable. When he finally reached the basement stairs, he paused, listening. The moans and whispers were joined by another sound, a soft scraping, like fingernails on stone. It was deliberate, calculated, and Nikita realized that whatever was below was aware of his approach. He descended slowly, each step measured, to avoid alerting the faceless shadow. The basement greeted him with an oppressive darkness that seemed to seep into his skin, chilling his blood. The shapes were there as before, standing silently, eyes, or empty sockets, directed at him in eerie unison. But something had changed. The faceless entity, the central figure among the others, now moved with a precision and purpose that suggested intelligence beyond human comprehension. It drifted among the shapes, touching them lightly as they responded with subtle movements, their forms twisting and elongating as if shaped by the will of the master shadow. Nikita's heart raced. He tried to reason, to convince himself that this was the result of starvation, hypothermia, or madness. But the logic failed. He had seen them, seen their deliberate coordination, their awareness of his presence. He realized that the basement was not merely a place for shadows. It was a nexus, a living organism born from the cruelty and suffering of the camp. Every scream, every act of despair, every whispered prayer had been collected, condensed, and now animated into something both horrifying and conscious. As he stepped further into the basement, he heard whispers clearly this time, distinct and intelligible. Nikita. Nikita. The voice was neither male nor female, neither alive nor dead, yet it carried the weight of countless voices layered atop one another. He felt his mind begin to fracture, as if the whispers were pulling at the threads of his consciousness. He stumbled backward, lantern tilting, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the walls. The faceless figure floated toward him, smooth and seamless, yet somehow solid, its presence pressing on him from all sides. Panic surged. Nikita wanted to flee, but the basement seemed to stretch endlessly, corridors and stairways elongating in impossible ways. The shadows shifted with a fluidity that defied physical laws, blocking escape routes, guiding him deeper into the heart of the darkness. Each step he took was measured and deliberate, yet he felt powerless against the gravitational pull of the entity. The moaning and whispers merged into a crescendo, a symphony of anguish that reverberated through his very bones. Nikita realized, with a clarity that terrified him, that the entity was not merely feeding on fear, it was shaping it, controlling it, bending reality within the confines of Block 7. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, for time had lost meaning in the oppressive dark. Nikita's limbs grew weak, his vision blurred, but still he pressed on, compelled by a mixture of dread and fascination. At the far end of the basement, a doorway appeared, one that he had not noticed before. It was narrow, almost hidden, with a faint light spilling from within. Driven by instinct, he entered. Inside was a room unlike any other he had seen in the camp. The walls were lined with what looked like ancient etchings, symbols carved into the stone that pulsed faintly with an inner glow. The air smelled of decay and ozone, electric and fetid at the same time. In the center of the room stood the faceless figure, surrounded by the shapes, now fully animated and twisting in ways that defied human anatomy. Nikita felt his mind tremble under the weight of understanding. These beings were born from suffering, yes, but they were also sentient, aware, and patient. They could anticipate every move, read every thought, and manipulate the environment around them. The whispers coalesced into a single message, clear and direct. You belong here, as all fear must. Nikita's blood ran cold. The basement, the shapes, the faceless shadow, they were not confined to this place. They could reach beyond, into the minds and dreams of anyone touched by terror. Nikita's thoughts spun. He realized the implications. The camp itself was irrelevant. Block 7 was a focal point, a seedbed for something that could grow anywhere fear existed. And yet, as the terror threatened to consume him, a small fragment of defiance remained. He would not surrender entirely. He had to survive, had to witness, had to understand. With trembling hands, he fumbled for his notebook, the one he had been keeping in secret, and began to sketch the symbols, the shapes, and the faceless figure. Even as the whispers clawed at his sanity, he recorded, desperate to preserve evidence of what the world had created and what it had unleashed. Suddenly, the shapes lunged, not at him, but into themselves, collapsing and merging as if responding to the faceless figure's command. The room quivered, walls vibrating, and the pulsing etchings on the stone glowed brighter. Nikita felt the pressure around him intensify, and for a brief moment, he understood the truth of their existence. They were not merely entities born of fear. They were the embodiment of the camp's cruelty, a crystallization of pain and terror into life. Each scream, each act of violence, each moment of despair had been absorbed, condensed, and animated into something eternal and inescapable. With a sudden clarity, he realized that escape was impossible. The basement, the shadows, the faceless figure, they were extensions of human suffering itself. Even if he ran, even if he left Block 7, he would carry them within him, and they would find a way to reach beyond the walls, beyond the snow and the barbed wire, beyond the years and decades that would follow. The camp had birthed something immortal, and it was patient, cunning, and relentless. Nikita stumbled backward, lanterns swinging, and the shapes recoiled momentarily, as if curious about his reaction. The faceless figure floated closer, the whispers intensifying, pressing directly against his consciousness. "Do you see now?" it seemed to ask, though no lips moved. "Do you understand the truth of fear?" Nikita's mind reeled. He had seen horrors, yes, but this was beyond comprehension. It was a living, conscious force, sustained by anguish, multiplying with every heartbeat it could sense. He fell to his knees, clutching the notebook, as the whispers sank into his mind, tugging at memories, twisting perception. Faces of fellow prisoners appeared in his vision, distorted, screaming silently, their forms bending into the shapes he had seen in the basement. The moans, the whispers, the ethereal shapes, they were all connected, all feeding, all observing. And in that instant, Nikita understood a terrible, unshakable truth. Block 7 was no longer a prison. It was a womb, a crucible for something beyond human morality, beyond human comprehension, and it had chosen him as a witness. Hours passed, or perhaps years, Nikita could not tell. The faceless figure drifted closer, inspecting him with an awareness that pierced his mind. He felt the pressure of all the collected suffering, all the anguish of the camp, pressing down, seeking to consume him entirely. And yet, within the terror, a single thought persisted. He must survive. He must bear witness. He must record. With trembling hands, he continued to sketch, to write, to note every detail, even as the shadows writhed and whispered and moaned. When dawn came, if it could be called that in such a place, the basement was quiet, deceptively so. Nikita emerged, exhausted, eyes hollow, mind fraying. The camp was waking, guards strolling as if nothing had changed, prisoners shuffling and murmuring in fear and confusion. And yet, he knew the truth. The faceless figure remained, patient, hidden, waiting. The shapes were everywhere, in the corners of vision, in the shadows of the walls, in the trembling of a prisoner's hand. The nightmare had not ended. It had only begun. By the time the sun, or what passed for daylight in the frozen wasteland of the camp, struggled over the horizon, Nikita had lost all sense of time. The basement, Block 7, the moans and whispers had merged into a continuous, inescapable reality. His body ached from weeks without rest, his mind frayed from hours spent under the faceless figure's gaze. Yet a part of him clung stubbornly to the thread of comprehension. He had seen what no one else had, and he carried the knowledge, whether he wanted it or not. The night began as it always did, a creeping silence settling over the camp, interrupted only by the occasional clatter of boots or the distant howl of the wind. Nikita waited, heart hammering, knowing that the faceless entity was out there, moving through the shadows, aware of his every thought. He felt the stirrings of the other prisoners, whispers of terror threading through the barracks, their minds brushing against his own in shared fear. It was then he understood a horrifying truth. The entity's reach extended beyond the basement, beyond Block 7 itself. It could touch the living even through the veil of sleep, through the boundaries of the mind, feeding on fear in ways that no human could resist. As night deepened, Nikita made a decision. He could no longer hide, no longer merely observe. The only way to survive, or perhaps to preserve the fragile shreds of his humanity, was to confront the entity, to face it directly in the basement where it held dominion. He slipped from his bunk, careful not to draw attention, lantern in hand, moving through corridors that now seemed alive with anticipation. The shadows stretched along the walls, elongated, twisting, subtly guiding him toward the hidden staircase that descended into the heart of Block 7. The basement greeted him with the same oppressive darkness, yet this night it felt different. The air was thick, charged, vibrating with an energy that pressed against his chest and forced shallow breaths. The shapes were waiting, coiled like predators, their faceless leader floating above them, observing with incomprehensible intent. The moans had become a chant, a cadence that resonated deep within Nikita, compelling him forward. He knew that retreat was impossible. The entity had anticipated every hesitation, every doubt, every heartbeat. He stepped into the room at the far end, the one lined with pulsing etchings that seemed alive. The faceless figure hovered in the center, surrounded by the writhing shapes. Nikita's lantern trembled in his grasp, casting flickering light across the walls, illuminating the carvings and the contorted forms. He realized that the symbols were not mere decoration. They were a language, a record of suffering, a map of anguish collected over months, perhaps years. And the entity, the faceless shadow, had mastered it. It was a conductor of human misery, a being born from cruelty and sustained by terror. A whisper, louder and more insistent than ever, filled his mind. "Do you understand, Nikita? Do you see what you are a part of?" He trembled, realizing that the entity did not merely observe. It communicated directly, bypassing speech, embedding itself in thought. The shapes shifted, bending, twisting, extending impossibly long limbs toward him. Nikita understood that they were testing him, gauging his reaction, exploring the limits of his fear. His mind reeled, yet amidst the terror, a spark of determination flickered. He could not flee. He could not submit. He had to endure, to record, to survive. Suddenly, the faceless figure moved toward him, gliding through the shapes with a precision that was almost elegant. The whispers intensified, forming coherent phrases. "You cannot leave. You belong to us. Your fear is our sustenance." Nikita's knees buckled. He felt himself being pulled toward the entity, not by physical force, but by something far more insidious, an irresistible draw of awareness, a magnetic pull of consciousness. He stumbled back, clutching his notebook, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of the entity's power. It was not merely a predator. It was an extension of the camp itself, a sentient embodiment of every act of cruelty and despair that had occurred within its walls. Hours passed, or perhaps seconds. Time had become meaningless. Nikita's mind struggled to comprehend the scale of what he faced. The shapes writhed, merged, split, and reformed, each movement deliberate, purposeful. The faceless figure hovered above, observing, orchestrating, a master of an unimaginable symphony of horror. And then, as he sank to his knees, exhausted, terrified, and overwhelmed, a revelation struck him with a clarity that froze him. The entity did not merely feed on fear. It could manipulate reality, warp perception, and extend its influence beyond the physical confines of Block 7. Desperation surged. Nikita scrambled to his feet, desperately clutching his lantern and notebook. He scribbled notes, diagrams, desperate to preserve the record of what he had seen. The entity reacted, sensing his defiance, and the shapes lunged toward him, not to harm, but to coerce, to integrate his consciousness into their collective awareness. The whispers became a chorus, an overwhelming tidal wave of sound that threatened to drown his sanity. Names of prisoners long dead, of guards and officials, of men and women who had suffered within the camp, all resonated in his mind. Each syllable a sharpened blade cutting into his understanding of reality. And then, as the crescendo reached its peak, Nikita did something unexpected. He closed his eyes, embracing the terror fully, allowing the entity to draw near, not resisting, not fleeing. He let the moans and whispers consume him, surrendering to the flow of fear and anguish that had been building for months. In that moment, a transformation occurred. The shapes paused, the faceless figure hesitated, and for a fleeting instant, Nikita felt a connection, a recognition, a spark of understanding that transcended language or reason. He was not merely a prisoner. He was now a witness, a vessel for knowledge too immense for human comprehension. When he opened his eyes, the basement seemed altered.
The shapes were still, the faceless figure hovering silently. Nikita felt the presence of the entity within him, a constant hum in the recesses of his mind.
He realized that survival did not mean escape. Survival meant becoming part of the continuum, a keeper of the camp's horrors, a recorder of the suffering that had birthed these beings. Fear had been the conduit, but knowledge was the shield. By understanding the entity, by acknowledging its existence, he had carved a fragile sanctuary for himself within the web of terror. The following days were a strange limbo. Nikita moved among the prisoners and guards, outwardly unchanged, yet inwardly transformed. He witnessed disappearances, whispered conversations, and fleeting glimpses of faceless shapes in the corners of his vision. Yet he remained untouched, shielded by his awareness, and driven by the compulsion to record, to document, to bear witness. The camp had become a living entity, and he, in some inexplicable way, had become a part of its mechanism, a node in the network of fear and observation. Weeks passed, or perhaps months. The northern winter deepened, snow covering the camp in a deceptive blanket of quiet. Yet Block 7 remained a heart of darkness, pulsing with unseen life, orchestrated by the faceless entity. Nikita continued his nightly vigil, descending to the basement, observing, recording, and preserving the truth. He had come to understand that the entity's patience was infinite, its awareness boundless. It did not merely haunt, it endured. And he, in turn, had become something more than human, a witness, a keeper, a participant in a horror that spanned the boundary between life and the unnatural. One night, as he crouched in the corner of the basement, notebook open and lantern dimmed, he noticed something different. The faceless figure floated closer than ever before, its presence enveloping him completely. The whispers merged into a singular voice, distinct and commanding. "You see now, Nikita. You understand the truth. There is no escape." For the first time, he did not feel fear. Instead, he felt a strange clarity, a recognition that the horror was eternal, and that knowledge itself was the only form of liberation. And then, the unimaginable occurred. The faceless figure extended a tendril of darkness, not to touch, but to mirror. Nikita saw his own face reflected in the void, his eyes hollow, his expression a perfect echo of the terror he had witnessed. Yet beneath the surface, there was comprehension, resolve, and a trace of defiance. He realized, with a final, shattering clarity, that he was both observer and participant, both human and vessel, bound to the entity yet separate, bearing witness to the camp's eternal nightmare. As dawn struggled to pierce the frozen sky, Nikita emerged from the basement, notebook clutched tightly. The camp appeared unchanged, guards pacing, prisoners shuffling, yet he knew the truth. Block 7 remained alive, a nexus of fear and suffering, and he carried it within him. And somewhere in the shadows, the faceless figure watched, patient, eternal, its hunger unfulfilled, yet for the first time, tempered by the awareness of one who had seen and endured. Nikita had survived, but survival was no longer freedom. He was a witness to an inhuman truth, a keeper of horrors beyond comprehension. And as the wind howled across the frozen grounds, carrying the faintest whispers of the basement into the sleeping camp, he knew that the nightmare was not confined to these walls. It would follow, patiently, infinitely, into minds, into dreams, into history itself. Block 7 had created something immortal, and he, Nikita Ivanov, was now its chronicler, bound by fear, knowledge, and an understanding that was both gift and curse. In the final moments of that long night, as the first light of the bleak northern winter touched the camp, Nikita whispered, not aloud but in thought, a single acknowledgement to the faceless entity. I see you. I understand you. And I will not forget. The response came not in words, but in presence, a shiver through the air, a weight pressing against reality itself. And somewhere, deep within the basement of Block 7, the shapes stirred, patient and eternal, as the faceless figure observed, waiting and enduring. The camp continued its daily routine. Guards marched, prisoners labored, and the frozen northern wind carried the faintest echoes of anguish. But somewhere, in the shadows and silence, something ancient and patient had taken root. And Nikita, chronicler of horrors, survivor of the basement, knew with certainty that Block 7 had changed not only the camp, but the world itself, an eternal heartbeat of fear, recorded in shadows, waiting, patient, and unyielding.